So why are we so green about green? There's a room here of folks that tell us that I don't think we really are green about green. So I think we kind of got this under our belts. We have policies and procedures now that certainly take us a long way down the path that we can call ourselves a little less green about green. So before we start, I want just to remind you of a few things. Everything I'm going to talk about today, and hopefully everything you're going to learn in the next 2 days, what exists is possible. It's all here. We are creating the future now. Conservation first, and people matter. It's really part of this discussion. So the overarching principles that we're going to talk about here are really ultimately for some of those, for the people, so for Albertans and for the greater good. So before we really get started, I want you to know, I believe in climate change. There is no plan B. I'm going to steal a line from Minister Phillips. In 2050, which is where we have some climate change goals for our province, for Canada, and globally around the world, I will be 77 years old. Okay, now that you've all done part of that math, you'll know my kids will be in their late 50s. Their kids, maybe my grandchildren, might be well past their university careers. The decisions we're making today for those goals can no longer wait. That's what I believe. Besides that, we might have been listening to this for a while. We've been having this conversation for a long time. As Tim alluded to, I used to work on energy efficiency programs way back in 1990. Energy efficiency programs that we've seen resurrected today, light bulb replacement programs, high efficiency motor programs, some of those programs that are talking about similar outcomes that started in the late 80s with Power Smart programming in Alberta. So this is a conversation that isn't new. So why is it unclear? Why are we still having this conversation? Well, we get a few mixed messages. So they're pretty clear there. We know. Year over year, we have the hardest years on record. We are consistently getting warmer, and we have some global goals to keep that below 2 degrees in terms of that warming. This is happening. We are on a trajectory where we are almost at the point where we are going to hit that. There is no debate about that climate science. So what are we going to do, and how can we do it? And remember, what exists is here. We have the technology, we have the tools, and we know how to mitigate some of these issues already. We just need to start implementing them. So why is energy efficiency important now? Well, it's not now. This is 1973. So for those of you who have done the math, no, this is also the year I was born. So in 1973, we had an energy crisis. So there were some outcomes from that energy crisis that talked about fuel efficiency. There were some factors that drove some of those efficiency standards that we see in place today that came out of the energy crisis in the 70s. So way back when, I'm going to skip back for a minute, back in the 85, I think, ASHRAE 90.1 began. So ASHRAE 90.1 is a standard, for those of you that don't know, a building standard that talks about efficiency within buildings. We also have, in 1997, the Canadian Model National Energy Code for buildings. And we had a program called the Commercial Building Incentive Program that actually started back in 1997, where we used to actually run energy modeling courses that sold out in this province to work on energy efficiency, and there was an incentive program in place. And then we all know, or hopefully we all know, about the LEED rating system from the CAGBC as well, that starts to raise that bar a little bit going further up the line. So we know it's time to cut carbon. The economics say it. This is the president of the World Bank actually talking about some of those impacts that we have, and the reason why it just makes good economic sense, and it's part of that moral obligation that Minister Phillips talked about. We also know that in Alberta, we have some work to do. So I work in the building sector primarily when I'm at Stantec, and we know that in that building sector, it's just over 7% of our emissions, but of those emissions, in Calgary and Edmonton, in those urban areas, up to 40% of those emissions are directly buildings related. So that's a pretty big win in those urban environments if we can stop and we can think about how we can implement strategies on the building sector only to really help with our greenhouse gas emissions. Skip over a few of these. This is a nice one that I like to point out. It also points out some of our electricity consumption. You'll see we're right near the top here. We're under the US and such, so our goal shouldn't be at the top. We have the ability and the technology. What exists is here to change this and to reduce our energy consumption. And it hits close to home sometimes. So when we talk about why this is important, you know, some of these climate change issues certainly happen. So we know about the floods in Fort McMurray, or the fires in Fort McMurray. There was floods the same year as Calgary as well in Fort McMurray. And the flooding that happened in Calgary in 2013. So for those of you that don't know this image, this is the district energy plant in Calgary, and that's an underpass on the left-hand side that the water is right up to. So what do we need to know? So the Alberta government has brought forward a climate leadership plan again in 2015, and there was a number of strategies set out in that plan that take us down this trajectory so that we can have some success. And that success in some of those recommendations included the likes of Energy Efficiency Alberta. And the reason we have some of that in place and we have those efforts coming is that we also know that 50% of the cost of owning a building is directly related to the operations. So we still have conversations in this market about first cost. First cost is your least cost. So when you're talking about new construction, let's be very clear that you are going to spend 50% of your budget for your taxpayers, your ratepayers, your community, and your consumers operating that building. We need to be conscious about those decisions we make early on in the design process or in the retrofit process that impact those additional costs over the life of that building. The good news is not only is it the right thing to do, it saves you money. This is a great example that I have from Oxford. They're one of my favorite Oxford properties. So they own a number of large buildings and projects that you're probably familiar with. They're the key owners of a number of Fairmont hotels, a number of towers in Calgary and Edmonton, and then alternate properties. What I want to point out to you is that since 2010, they've seen a 29% reduction in their energy usage in all their facilities. In addition to that, they have seen occupant experiences, and they've seen their recommendations from their occupants at 84%. So 90% of their staff believes that they have the ability to change the behavior within their buildings and that they are owning that commitment within their buildings for their tenants. So they're recruiting tenants, they're making money, they're reducing, their employees are engaged, so there's some recruitment and retention there, and it's the right thing to do. So they have this figured out. This is not new to them. It's good business to be energy efficient. Moreover, this is an example from a school. We know energy costs are increasing. So these are some examples between 2006 and 2008 on a couple of schools, and we see that there's anywhere between a 42% and a 58% increase in these schools alone, just on energy costs. So it's really good sense. In terms of schools, I also want to just point out that the generation that's coming up right now, just in case we all need a little reminder, they expect nothing less than energy efficient schools and buildings to learn in. So nothing warms my heart than seeing that. This is a great example of some work that the Alberta Council on Environmental Education did with a number of students that went forward in June 2016 to the legislature, making recommendations for schools in terms of what they expected in terms of climate leadership. So I had the privilege this morning of attending Joseph Moreau School and talking to some of their students here in Edmonton. They're working on water recycling systems and how they can conserve water. So they've moved beyond energy, and they're well into what I think we'll have a crew on the road 4 or 5 years from now, talking about water efficiency and how we can mitigate some of that. But they're already thinking about that. They expect nothing less than what we're already doing. So these are some good examples just from a school perspective. It starts to bring that into play. So this is an example of a net zero school in Texas. So it starts the day, as soon as you walk into the door, it says, it's a great day, you've arrived at Net Zero Lee at Lee Valley Elementary School. They have solar on the roof, they have wind outside. Nothing warms my heart like watching students learn the math curriculum by adding the kilowatt hours from their live energy dashboard. So they're actually learning in real time and have engaged that into their curriculum so that they're seeing that happen. Talks about well-lit, daylit space. We got that one in there again. So where have we come from here? So the good news is, Minister Phillips had pointed out, is that we have programs and opportunities in place now. So if you haven't been there already, take advantage of the programs that we have that are there. Talk to Jeff over at the Energy Efficiency Alberta booth. Find out about the BNI. He just put his hand up over there. Find out about that BNI program. Work with your consultant team. Work with those who are involved with you to help find the best strategies and the path forward so that you can start to mitigate that. If you have any questions, there are a plethora of folks around the table in this room and so forth over the next 2 days that are going to help you with guidance and strategies and answers to get you to the goal and the outcomes that you are desiring in terms of your energy efficiency or your greenhouse gas reductions or your occupant comfort, or if you really just want to be clear about it, this is a conversation about people. How are your facilities operated? How are they managed? Are people comfortable inside? Do they want to be there? Is there enough daylight? All of those good things that you're trying to do in terms of your building, at the end of the day, are about the people that are inside. That's why we have buildings. That's why they are there. If we consider all of those factors, that will help with that decision-making process. So we talked a little bit, or Minister Phillips talked a little bit about the BNI program. So this is everything from HVAC systems to lighting systems, as well as a new, or in addition, there's a high-efficiency motor program that just started as well. I want to remind you, though, that just like Grandma said, that no solar dessert until you eat your conservation veggies. So part of this efficiency conversation, and I'm sorry to those solar folks in the room, there will be an end to this, I promise, is that we really should talk about conservation first. Conservation is the first strategy. The intent is not to put the largest array on the least efficient building. I appreciate solar is sexy. I appreciate that everybody can see it. I certainly understand that it creates an optic that you are doing the right thing. The right thing takes investment. I understand that. But let's make sure that we're putting the smallest array on the most efficient building. Why? Because it costs 6 times more to generate versus conserve. That's an Alberta stat. So every dollar we spend, let's use it wisely. Let's talk about that conservation first. And let's make sure that we have our building operations up to speed, and then we're going to put the solar panels on the roof. Let's make sure that we're making that investment in the right order. So there's a few things for the owner here. So what do we talk about when we're talking about that? Well, there's potentially some first costs, so higher costs, but there's lower operating costs. Make sure that you're not robbing Peter to pay Paul. Make sure that your pockets are combined somewhere. Think about those operation costs. Make sure you have a smarter building. Continuous commissioning. So that's that ongoing cycle. If you get a Ferrari, you still go and get it tuned up. If you get a Ford Focus, you still go and get it tuned up. Having that continuous commissioning process throughout your building, making sure that you're constantly monitoring and evaluating the systems that you have in place, tweaking and reporting it, so that that happens and you know what those efficiencies look like. Trevor from the City of Calgary is going to talk a little bit about that tomorrow, and I encourage you to go and listen to his session and his experience at Ralph Klein Park in Calgary, which is a LEED Platinum Center, but how they have actually been doing that live. So I'd also consider, and in terms of schools and other things, other projects that have multiple public engagement, use it as a teaching tool. Leverage yourself in terms of your rec centers, your community centers, and your libraries in your community to teach the community about efficiency. You know, raise the flag and say, we did this. Pay that forward and start that ripple within your community. It saves them money. It saves you money. It creates a better building. And it helps the general population start to become more and more aware of efficiency overall. Put up the sign that says, this month we saved 20% on our energy usage. Help us conserve. We all have skin in this game. And when you ask for public participation, you'd be surprised at the results when we start asking people to cooperate when they understand that that is also their pocket they're dipping into. And we already, Minister Phillips stole all my thunder, talked a little bit about, about the senior center as well. Those saved operating costs really talk about being able to use those savings and leverage them forward for things like programming and other options that maybe are your core business. So there's some design considerations, but we're going to skip over that. But I want you to think just a little further. So we know we have a lot of projects on the board, and you're probably going to hear a lot in the next few days about net zero energy. So when we have buildings that create as much energy as they use over a year. But I want to challenge you all just a little bit to think beyond energy for a while. Buildings are a system. They operate as a system. And I want you to think about things like net zero water. So I want you to imagine that this is a system. So this is a school that's Stantected in Frederick County in the US that is a net zero water school. They use as much water on site as they put back into the system, and they have a significant design, and they use that as a teaching tool as well. So this goes beyond energy itself and into some other strategies that talk about that energy usage and using water as well. So a little more restorative or additional step. So a few things there. So a few things here in this conversation. What exists is possible. Over the next 2 days, you are going to hear a number of strategies. They are all possible. These are successes and failures that are replicable, not the failures, hopefully, learnable, and you can take them forward. There are fantastic speakers over the next 2 days. You're creating the future now. 2050 seems like a long way away. It's not. The decisions you make today will have impacts in 2050. Keep that as your lens when you're making decisions in terms of your built environment. Conservation first, and lastly, this is really about people. That's the end of the day. That's what we are making decisions for. You're making the decisions for maybe my children, for my grandchildren, and for your grandchildren. And that is it. Thank you very much.